The crack of a gunshot shattered the eerie silence of East Side's shadowy streets. Officer Luke Carter's hand flew to his holster, adrenaline surging through his veins. His partner Roy's panicked voice crackled over the radio. "Shots fired! Suspect on foot, heading down Maple!" Luke's eyes narrowed as he spotted a figure darting between the dilapidated buildings. Without hesitation, he gunned the engine, tires screeching against wet asphalt. The chase was on. Suddenly, a woman stepped into the street, right into their path. Luke cursed, slamming on the brakes. The cruiser fishtailed, narrowly missing her. As the car skidded to a stop, Luke's frustration boiled over. This woman had just let their suspect escape. He flung open his door, rage etched on his face. "You!" he shouted, advancing on her. "Hands where I can see them! Now!" The woman, Alexandria, raised her hands slowly, her face a mask of calm despite the chaos. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind raced. As an undercover FBI agent, she knew this confrontation could blow her entire operation. And Officer Luke Carter had no idea he was about to arrest the very person investigating his department for corruption. "Officer, I apologize. I didn't see your vehicle," Alex said, her voice steady despite the tension coursing through her body. She could feel the weight of her concealed badge pressing against her ribs, a constant reminder of the precarious situation she now found herself in. Luke circled her like a predator, his eyes scanning for any sign of threat or deception. The years of working in Eastside had hardened him, eroding the idealism that had once driven him to join the force. Now, all he saw was another potential criminal, another obstacle in his path. "ID now," he barked, his hand still resting on his holster. "What the hell are you doing out here at this hour?" Alex weighed her options quickly. Revealing her true identity would jeopardize months of undercover work, potentially letting corrupt officers walk free. But refusing could escalate the situation dangerously. "I'm just heading home from work," she replied, slowly reaching for her pocket. "I'm a night janitor at the office building on 5th and Main." Luke scoffed, disbelief evident in his voice. "Yeah, right. This time of night, in this neighborhood. You expect me to believe that?" As Alex produced a carefully crafted fake ID, Roy jogged up, breathless from his pursuit of the original suspect. "Lost him," he panted, frustration clear on his face. He disappeared into the abandoned factory on Elm. Luke snatched the ID from Alex's hand, scrutinizing it closely. "Alexandria Washington," he read aloud, his tone mocking. "Well, Ms. Washington, you picked the wrong night to take a stroll in East Side." Alex maintained her composure, years of training kicking in. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm simply trying to get home." Luke's face hardened, his patience wearing thin. The adrenaline from the chase, coupled with the frustration of losing their suspect, pushed him over the edge. "That's it," he growled, grabbing Alex's arm roughly. "You're coming with us." Obstructing a police investigation, potential accomplice to a shooting suspect. As Luke spun her around and slammed her against the cruiser, Alex's mind raced. This was exactly the kind of police misconduct she'd been investigating, but she never expected to become a victim of it herself. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her, even as the cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists. "You're making a mistake," Alex said quietly, as Luke shoved her into the back of the patrol car. "This isn't right, and you know it." "Okay." Luke slammed the door shut, cutting off any further protest. He turned to Roy, who was watching the scene with a mixture of unease and resignation. "Let's get her back to the station," Luke said gruffly. "We'll see how tough she is after a night in lockup." As they drove through the rain-slicked streets of East Side, Alex leaned her head against the cool window, her mind working overtime. She knew that every minute she spent in custody increased the risk of her cover being blown. But she also recognized an opportunity. This could be the break she needed to gather concrete evidence of police misconduct. In the front seat, Luke's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The anger that had been simmering for years threatened to boil over. He was sick of the crime, sick of the corruption that seemed to infect every corner of East Side. In his mind, everyone was a potential threat, every citizen a possible criminal. He couldn't see that his own actions were perpetuating the very cycle of mistrust and abuse he claimed to be fighting against. Roy, for his part, remained silent. He had long ago learned to follow Luke's lead, to not question his partner's methods. But tonight felt different. The woman in the back seat didn't fit the profile of their usual suspects. A nagging doubt began to gnaw at him, a feeling that they might have crossed a line they couldn't uncross. As they pulled into the station, the reality of the situation began to sink in for all three occupants of the car. For Alex, it was the realization that her undercover operation was hanging by a thread. For Luke, it was another night of processing a suspect, another small battle in his personal war against what he saw as the decay of his city. And for Roy, it was the growing unease that maybe, just maybe, they had made a terrible mistake. Little did any of them know, but the events set in motion on this rain-soaked night would soon spiral into a confrontation that would shake the entire police department to its core. The lines between right and wrong, between justice and corruption, were about to become irrevocably blurred. As Luke roughly pulled Alex from the car, leading her into the stark fluorescent lights of the police station, the stage was set for a showdown that would force each of them to confront their own beliefs about justice, duty, and the true meaning of serving and protecting. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Alexandria's face as Luke roughly guided her through the doors. The night shift officers looked up with mild interest, but most quickly returned to their work. Just another arrest in East Side. "Sit," Luke commanded, shoving Alex towards a hard plastic chair near his desk. She complied silently, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. Years of training had taught her to be observant, even in the most stressful situations. Roy hovered nearby, his discomfort evident in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Luke, maybe you should start on the paperwork," Luke cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. Roy hesitated for a moment before nodding and moving to his own desk. Luke turned his attention back to Alex, looming over her with an air of authority. "All right, Ms. Washington, let's go over this again. What were you really doing out there tonight?" Alex met his gaze steadily. "As I said, Officer Carter, I was walking home from work. I'm a night janitor." Save it," Luke snapped. "You expect me to believe that? In that neighborhood? At that time of night? No. You were up to something. Maybe look out for our shooter? Or perhaps you've got some product on you." "I have nothing illegal on me, officer," Alex replied calmly. "You're welcome to search me, but I assure you, you won't find anything." Luke's eyes narrowed. Her composure was unnerving him. Most suspects he brought in were either belligerent or terrified. This woman's calm defiance was something new, and it was getting under his skin. "Oh, we'll search you all right," he growled. "And when we find whatever you're hiding, you'll be looking at some serious time." As Luke began to pat her down, Alex closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She knew she was walking a dangerous line. Her instincts as an FBI agent screamed at her to reveal her identity, to end this farce. But the rational part of her mind knew that doing so would destroy months of careful work. She was close. So close to cracking open the corruption case she'd been building. She couldn't throw it all away now. The search, as she knew it would, turned up nothing illegal. Luke's frustration was palpable as he stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "Book her!" he barked at Roy. Obstruction of justice, resisting arrest. Roy's eyes widened. "Luke, I don't think—" "Did I ask what you think?" Luke snapped. "Book her. Now." As Roy began the booking process, taking her fingerprints and mugshot, Alex's mind raced. She knew her prints would be in the system. It was only a matter of time before her true identity was revealed. She needed to buy time, to figure out a way to salvage the situation. Little did she know, events were already in motion that would change everything. As Alex sat in the holding cell, her back against the cold concrete wall, her mind drifted to the path that had led her here. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, Alexandria Washington had always been driven by a strong sense of justice. She saw firsthand the effects of systemic racism and corruption, watching as her community struggled under the weight of biased policing and economic neglect. Her father, a postal worker, and her mother, a nurse, had instilled in her a deep respect for hard work and integrity. "You can't control the system," her father would say, "but you can control how you respond to it. Always do what's right, even when it's hard." Those words had guided Alex through her years at the police academy. She had entered with high hopes, determined to be the change she wanted to see in law enforcement. But it didn't take long for reality to set in. The casual racism, the blue wall of silence, the US vs them mentality. It all chipped away at her idealism. She watched as good cops stayed silent in the face of misconduct, as bad cops were protected by the system. It was during her second year on the force that she made a decision that would change the course of her life. A routine traffic stop had turned violent. Her partner at the time, a veteran officer named Mike Greggs, had escalated the situation, using excessive force on a young black man for no apparent reason. When Alex tried to intervene, Greggs had turned on her, warning her to stay in her lane. That night, as she sat in her apartment, nursing bruised knuckles and a heavy heart, Alex made a call to the FBI. She couldn't change the system from within the police force, but maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference from the outside. The transition wasn't easy. Her background in law enforcement made her valuable to the Bureau, but it also made her a target. She had to prove herself twice as hard, work twice as long, just to be taken seriously. But Alex was no stranger to adversity. Her first undercover assignment came 6 months into her FBI training. It was supposed to be a simple operation: infiltrate a small-time drug ring operating out of a local community college. Alex had thrown herself into the role, adopting the persona of a struggling student looking to make some quick cash. For weeks, she had walked a tightrope, balancing her cover identity with the need to gather evidence. There were moments of heart-pounding fear, like when one of the gang members had grown suspicious and insisted on searching her apartment. Alex had managed to talk her way out of it, but the close call had left her shaken. But there were victories too. The thrill of successfully passing along crucial information to her handlers. The satisfaction of seeing pieces of the puzzle fall into place. And when the operation finally culminated in a series of coordinated raids, Alex had felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she'd experienced on the police force. That first success had led to more assignments, each more complex than the last. She infiltrated white-collar crime rings, broke up human trafficking operations, and slowly built a reputation as one of the Bureau's most effective agents. But the case that brought her to East Side was different. This wasn't about drugs or organized crime. This was about the rot at the heart of law enforcement itself. For months, she had been gathering evidence of a complex web of corruption within the East Side Police Department. Bribes, evidence tampering, excessive use of force, it all pointed to a systemic problem that went far beyond a few bad apples. Alex's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching her cell. She straightened up, composing her features into a mask of calm defiance. Whatever came next, she was ready. Officer Luke Carter stood at the window of the break room, a cup of lukewarm coffee cooling in his hand as he stared out at the rain-slicked streets of East Side. His reflection in the glass looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than he remembered. How had it come to this? He could still remember his first day on the force, fresh-faced and idealistic, ready to make a difference. East Side had been a tough beat even then, but he had been determined to be one of the good guys, to serve and protect. But year after year, the reality of the job had worn him down. He'd seen partners injured, good cops burned out and quit, while the crime and poverty in East Side seemed to only get worse. The system was broken, and no matter how hard he tried, nothing seemed to change. It started small, looking the other way when a fellow officer roughed up a suspect a little too much, taking a few bucks from a drug bust before logging the evidence. Little compromises that he justified to himself as necessary evils in the war against crime. But those small compromises led to bigger ones. Soon, he was part of a network of cops who saw themselves as the only thing standing between order and chaos in East Side. If they had to break a few rules to keep the peace, so be it. If they skimmed a little off the top to compensate for the danger and stress of their jobs, who could blame them? Luke took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. He thought about the woman in the holding cell, Alexandria Washington. There was something about her that didn't sit right with him. She was too calm, too collected. Most people they brought in were either belligerent or terrified, but she acted like she had nothing to fear. A nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, she really was innocent. Maybe he had crossed a line this time. But Luke pushed the thought away. In East Side, everyone was guilty of something. It was just a matter of figuring out what. As he stood there, lost in thought, Luke's mind wandered to the events that had led him down this path. He remembered his first partner, a grizzled veteran named Frank, who had taken Luke under his wing. Frank had been the one to introduce him to the unofficial ways of doing things in East Side. "Listen, kid," Frank had said one night after a particularly rough shift. "You want to survive in this job? You gotta understand that sometimes the rules don't work. Sometimes you gotta make your own justice." At the time, Luke had been shocked. But as the months wore on, he began to see what Frank meant. The courts were overloaded, criminals walked free on technicalities, and the good people of East Side suffered. Slowly, Luke had started to adopt Frank's philosophy. It was subtle at first, roughing up a known drug dealer a little more than necessary during an arrest, planting evidence on a suspect they knew was guilty but couldn't prove it. Each time, Luke told himself it was for the greater good, that he was doing what needed to be done to keep East Side safe. But the line between right and wrong had become increasingly blurred. The extra cash from skimmed drug busts helped pay for his daughter's braces. The favors from local business owners meant better Christmas presents for his kids. And all the while, Luke convinced himself that he was still one of the good guys, still fighting the good fight. Now, standing in the break room with Alexandria Washington's calm defiance replaying in his mind, Luke felt the first real stirrings of doubt. Had he gone too far? Had he become the very thing he had sworn to fight against when he first put on the badge? "Hey, Carter!" a voice called from the doorway, snapping Luke out of his reverie. He turned to see Sergeant Miller, a heavy-set man with a perpetual scowl. "Got the results back on your collar. You're gonna want to see this." Luke followed Miller to his office, curiosity piqued. As he read the report Miller handed him, his eyes widened in disbelief. "This can't be right," he muttered, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Miller leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Oh, it's right, all right. Your little janitorial suspect? She's FBI. Undercover." The implications hit Luke like a physical blow. An undercover FBI agent. In East Side, it could only mean one thing. They were being investigated. As the reality of the situation sank in, Luke felt his world begin to crumble around him. Everything he'd done, all the lines he'd crossed. It was all about to come crashing down. "What do we do?" he asked, hating how weak his voice sounded. Miller's eyes hardened. "We do what we have to protect our own." Whoa. As Luke left the office, his mind was racing. He had a choice to make, and he knew that whatever he decided would define the rest of his life. The path that had seemed so clear, so justified just hours ago, now stretched before him like a treacherous minefield. He thought of his family, of the life he had built. He thought of his fellow officers, men and women he had come to see as brothers and sisters in arms. And he thought of Alexandria Washington, the FBI agent whose arrest might just be the thread that unravels everything. Luke Carter stood at a crossroads, the weight of his past pressing down on him, the uncertainty of his future looming large. As he walked back towards the holding cells, he knew that the decisions he made in the next few hours would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in East Side. The game had changed, and Luke was no longer sure if he even knew the rules. The precinct hummed with a nervous energy, whispered conversations, and furtive glances bouncing off the cold, stark walls. Word of Alexandria's true identity spread like wildfire. igniting a powder keg of fear and paranoia among the officers. Luke burst out of Miller's office, his face ashen, eyes wild with panic. He nearly collided with Roy, who had been anxiously waiting outside. "Luke, what's going on?" Roy asked, grabbing his partner's arm. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Luke jerked away, his voice a harsh whisper. "She's FBI, Roy. Undercover. We're screwed." Roy's eyes widened in shock. "What? How? What do we do?" Before Luke could respond, a commotion erupted near the holding cells. Both officers rushed over to find Alex engaged in a heated argument with Officer Simmons, a rookie known for his short temper. "I said, step back from the bars," Simmons shouted, his hand hovering dangerously close to his weapon. Alex stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "And I said, I have the right to make a phone call. Or have you forgotten basic protocol, officer?" Luke intervened, pushing Simmons back. "Stand down," he growled. "I've got this." He turned to Alex, their eyes locking in a silent battle of wills. "You'll get your phone call," he said finally. "But don't think for a second that this changes anything." "Oh." As Luke led Alex to the phone, Roy watched with growing unease. The precinct felt like a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest spark. Alex's fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the number, acutely aware of Luke's looming presence beside her. The phone rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. "This is Chen." "Oh, sir, it's Washington," Alex said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "The situation has evolved. I'm at Eastside Precinct. They know." There was a pause on the other end. Then Chen's voice came back, clipped and urgent. "Understood. Hold your position. Backup is on the way. ETA 20 minutes. The line went dead. Alex slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle, her mind racing. 20 minutes. She had to hold out for 20 minutes. She turned to face Luke, whose face was a mask of barely contained rage and fear. "Well?" he demanded. Alex allowed a small, defiant smile to play across her lips. "Tick-tock, Officer Carter. Your time is running out." Luke's mind reeled as he marched Alex back to the holding cell. 20 minutes. They had 20 minutes to decide their fate. He burst into Miller's office, where several senior officers had gathered. "We've got incoming," he announced, his voice tight with tension. "FBI will be here in 20 minutes." The room erupted into chaos. Voices shouted over each other, panic and desperation filling the air. "We need to destroy the evidence. What about the money from the Lawrence bust? We should run while we still can." Miller's voice cut through the din like a whip crack. "Enough! We're not running, and we're sure as hell not going down without a fight." He turned to Luke, his eyes cold and determined. "Carter, take care of our FBI friend. Make sure she can't talk." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. "You don't mean—" "Oh, or—" Miller's gaze didn't waver. "I mean, do whatever it takes to protect our own. Are we clear?" Luke nodded slowly, feeling as if he was sealing his own fate. As he left the office, Roy fell into step beside him. "Luke, we can't do this," Roy pleaded. "It's not too late to come clean, to do the right thing." For a moment, Luke hesitated. Then he remembered his family, his children. What would happen to them if he went down? "There's no going back, Roy," he said grimly. "It's us or them now." Alex paced her cell, every nerve on high alert. She could feel the change in the air, the desperation emanating from the officers. She knew she was in danger. Footsteps approached, and she turned to see Luke and Roy. The look in Luke's eyes sent a chill through her. "Time for a little trip, Agent Washington," Luke said, his voice cold. As they led her out of the cell, Alex's mind raced. She couldn't let them take her out of the precinct. Whatever happened, she had to stall until backup arrived. In a swift motion, she drove her elbow into Roy's solar plexus and made a break for it. She only made it a few steps before Luke tackled her to the ground. "Nice try," he growled, roughly pulling her to her feet. "But your time's up." As Luke and Roy forcibly led Alex towards the back exit, the main doors of the precinct burst open. Agent Chen strode in, flanked by a team of FBI agents, their badges glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "FBI, Nobody move! Chen's voice boomed through the station. Time seemed to stand still. Luke's grip on Alex's arm tightened painfully as the reality of the situation crashed down around him. In that frozen moment, Alex met Luke's eyes. She saw the fear, the desperation, but also a flicker of something else. Regret? Resignation? "It's over, Luke," she said softly. "But it's not too late to do the right thing." For a heartbeat, the outcome hung in the balance. Then slowly, Luke's grip loosened. His shoulders sagged as the fight drained out of him. "You're right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "God help me, you're right." As the FBI agents swarmed the precinct, Luke Carter, once a proud officer of the law, held out his wrists for the handcuffs, the weight of his choices finally catching up to him. The tense standoff at East Side Precinct had come to an end, but for Alex, Luke, and everyone involved, the real battle was just beginning. The road to justice would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, there was hope for real change in East Side. The East Side Precinct erupted into chaos as FBI agents swarmed through the building. Agent Chen's voice cut through the pandemonium, sharp and authoritative. "This is a federal operation. All officers, hands where we can see them." Luke Carter stood frozen, his grip on Alex's arm loosening as the reality of the situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. In that moment of stunned inaction, Alex seized her opportunity. She twisted out of Luke's grasp and in one fluid motion grabbed his handcuffs and snapped them onto his wrists. "Luke Carter, you're under arrest," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Alex recited the Miranda rights, Luke's eyes darted around the precinct, taking in the scene of his fellow officers being restrained and disarmed. His gaze finally settled on Roy, who stood with his hands raised, a look of resigned defeat on his face. Agent Chen strode over, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Agent Washington, excellent work. Are you all right?" Alex nodded, the weight of months of undercover work finally lifting from her shoulders. "I'm fine, sir, but we need to secure the evidence quickly. There's a hidden safe in Sergeant Miller's office that contains documentation of all their illegal activities." Chen barked orders to his team, and two agents rushed towards Miller's office. The sergeant, his face purple with rage, lunged at them, but was quickly subdued. As the FBI agents systematically swept through the precinct, securing evidence and detaining officers, Alex turned her attention back to Luke. The once proud officer now stood slumped, the fight gone out of him. "Why?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why go through all this? You could have just arrested us from the start." Alex's expression softened slightly. "Because it wasn't just about arresting a few corrupt cops, Luke. We needed to expose the entire system. The bribes, the evidence tampering, the excessive force. It all goes far beyond this precinct. We needed irrefutable evidence to bring down the whole network." Luke's face contorted with a mix of anger and despair. "You don't understand. We were just trying to survive, to make a difference in a system that's rigged against us." "By becoming the very thing you swore to fight against?" Alex countered, her voice sharp. "You had a choice, Luke. Every time you took a bribe, every time you looked the other way, you had a choice." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Captain Sanders, the highest-ranking officer in the precinct, had arrived. His face paled as he took in the scene before him. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, trying to muster an authoritative tone despite the tremor in his voice. Agent Chen stepped forward, his badge held high. "Captain Sanders, your precinct is being shut down pending a full federal investigation into systemic corruption and abuse of power." Sanders' composure cracked. "You can't do this. We have jurisdiction here." "This is our turf." "Not anymore," Chen replied coldly. "We have evidence linking you and several of your officers to a multi-million-dollar drug trafficking operation. Your turf is now federal property." As Sanders was led away in handcuffs, protesting loudly, Alex felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Roy, unrestrained and looking conflicted. "Agent Washington," he said hesitantly, I
But
I want to cooperate. I know what we did was wrong, and I want to make it right. Uh, Alex studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's a start, Officer Jennings. But you need to understand, the road to redemption is long and difficult. Are you prepared for that? Roy squared his shoulders, a flicker of determination in his eyes. Yes, ma'am, I am. As Roy was led away to give his statement, Alex's attention was drawn to a group of junior officers huddled in the corner, looking shell-shocked and uncertain. She approached them slowly, hands held out in a non-threatening gesture. I know this is a lot to take in, she said gently, but I want you to understand something. This operation wasn't about punishing good cops. It was about rooting out the corruption that's been poisoning this precinct and this community for years. One of the young officers, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, spoke up. But what happens now? To us? To East Side? Alex took a deep breath. Now we rebuild. We work to restore trust between the police and the community. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if you're willing to be part of the solution, there's a place for you in the new East Side PD. As the gravity of the situation settled over the precinct, Alex felt a mix of emotions wash over her. There was satisfaction at seeing justice served, but also a deep sadness at the extent of the corruption they had uncovered. These were men and women who had sworn to protect and serve, and somewhere along the way they had lost sight of that oath. Outside the precinct a crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion and the fleet of FBI vehicles. News vans were already setting up, reporters clamoring for information. Agent Chen approached Alex, his face grim. Washington, we need to make a statement. The public needs to know what's happened here, but we also need to manage this carefully. We can't risk causing panic or undermining faith in law enforcement as a whole. Alex nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. As she followed Chen towards the press gathering, she caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Sarah, the young woman whose wrongful arrest had first alerted Alex to the depth of corruption in the precinct, stood at the front of the group, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and vindication. Their eyes met, and Alex gave a small nod. Sarah's testimony had been crucial in building the case, and her courage in coming forward had played a significant role in bringing this day to fruition. As Alex stepped up to the hastily assembled podium, the clamor of the crowd died down. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about Eastside anymore. What happened here today would have ripple effects throughout the entire law enforcement community. Good evening, she began, her voice steady and clear. I'm Special Agent Alexandria Washington of the FBI. Today, we've taken a significant step in addressing systemic corruption within the Eastside Police Department. As Alex delivered the carefully worded statement, she could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of the gathered crowd. Citizens who had long suspected corruption but felt powerless to fight it. Fellow law enforcement officers grappling with the betrayal of their colleagues. Journalists furiously scribbling notes, already envisioning the headlines that would dominate the news cycle for weeks to come. Inside the precinct, Luke Carter watched the press conference on a small TV in the holding area. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions: anger, shame, fear, and somewhere beneath it all, a glimmer of relief. The weight of his actions, the lies and compromises that had slowly eroded his integrity, had been crushing him for years. Now finally it was over. As the night wore on, the full scale of the operation became clear. It wasn't just the East Side precinct. Similar raids were being conducted across the city, targeting a network of corruption that had infiltrated multiple levels of law enforcement and local government. Alex worked tirelessly, coordinating with other agents, processing evidence, and conducting initial interviews with the arrested officers. It was well past midnight when Agent Chen finally approached her, concern evident on his face. Washington, you've done exceptional work here, but you need to rest. We've got a long road ahead of us, and I need you at your best. Alex wanted to protest, but the exhaustion of months of undercover work, coupled with the intensity of the night's events, was finally catching up to her. She nodded, allowing herself to be led to a quiet corner of the precinct. As she sat down, her gaze fell on a family photo on a nearby desk. It showed a smiling Luke Carter with his wife and children. The sight hit Alex hard, reminding her of the human cost of what had transpired here tonight. Corruption didn't just destroy institutions, it destroyed families, communities, lives. The sound of approaching footsteps roused Alex from her thoughts. She looked up to see Sarah, the young woman from the crowd, being escorted in by an FBI agent. "Agent Washington," Sarah said hesitantly. "They said I could speak with you." Alex stood, offering a tired smile. "Sarah, thank you for coming. Your courage in coming forward was instrumental in making this happen." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears. I never thought I'd see this day. When they arrested me, when no one believed me about what those officers did. I felt so helpless. But you listened. You believed me." Alex placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Your voice mattered, Sarah. It was the first domino that led to all of this. Never underestimate the power of speaking up against injustice." As Sarah left, Alex felt a renewed sense of purpose. The night's events had been a crucial victory, but it was only the beginning. The real work, rebuilding trust, reforming the system, ensuring that this level of corruption could never take root again, was still ahead. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon as Alex finally left the precinct. The streets of Eastside, usually bustling with early morning activity, were eerily quiet. News of the night's events had spread quickly, and there was a palpable sense of shock and uncertainty in the air. As she walked to her car, Alex's mind was already racing with the challenges that lay ahead. Press conferences, court proceedings, the monumental task of rebuilding the Eastside PD from the ground up. But for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but tonight had proven that change was possible, that even in the face of systemic corruption, justice could prevail. As she drove away from the precinct, leaving behind the chaos and uncertainty of the night, Alex allowed herself a small smile. The battle had been won, but the war for the soul of Eastside was just beginning, and Alexandria Washington was ready for the fight. 3 months after the Eastside raid, Alexandria Washington stood before the federal court, preparing to give her final testimony in the trial of Luke Carter and the other former corrupt police officers. Her eyes swept across the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Luke. He looked a decade older, the weight of his guilt and consequences etched deeply on his face. As Alex began to speak, her voice echoed through the silent courtroom. She detailed the months of undercover work, the widespread corruption she had uncovered, and the price the community had paid for the officers' betrayal of trust. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Alex concluded, her voice firm and unwavering, "what we've seen here isn't just about a few bad apples. It's about a system that allowed corruption to take root and flourish. It's about the erosion of trust between law enforcement and the communities they're sworn to protect. But most importantly, it's about the possibility of change, of rebuilding that trust, and of creating a justice system that truly serves all citizens equally." As Alex stepped down from the witness stand, she felt a mixture of relief and determination. The trial had been grueling, forcing her to relive some of the most challenging moments of her career. But it had also been cathartic, a necessary step in the healing process for both her and the community. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some held signs supporting the prosecution, others demanding broader police reform. As Alex emerged, a hush fell over the crowd. She spotted familiar faces. Sarah, the young woman whose wrongful arrest had sparked the investigation. Roy Jennings, the former officer who had turned state's witness. And members of the community who had bravely come forward with their stories of police misconduct. The jury's deliberation lasted 3 days. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through Eastside. Justice had been served, but the real work was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Alex found herself at the forefront of a massive reform effort. The Eastside Police Department was being rebuilt from the ground up, with a focus on community policing, accountability, and transparency. New training programs were implemented, emphasizing de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. One crisp autumn morning, Alex stood before a group of new police academy recruits. As she looked at their eager, somewhat nervous faces, she was reminded of her own first days in law enforcement. "You're entering this profession at a crucial time," she began. "The events in Eastside have shaken public trust in law enforcement to its core, but they've also created an opportunity to redefine what it means to protect and serve."
Oh,
She paused, making eye contact with each recruit. "Your job won't be easy. You'll face challenges, both from within the system and from a public that may be skeptical of your intentions. But remember this: integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." As the months passed, signs of change began to emerge in Eastside. Crime rates started to drop as community police relations improved. Citizens who had once been afraid to call the police now felt comfortable reaching out for help. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Years of mistrust couldn't be erased overnight, but it was progress. A year to the day after the raid, Alex found herself back at the East Side precinct. The building had been renovated, its dark, oppressive atmosphere replaced with an open, welcoming design. As she walked through the halls, she saw a mix of familiar and new faces. Officers chatted easily with community members who had come in to report issues or simply to connect. In the captain's office, once Sergeant Miller's domain, sat Captain Lydia Chen, a respected veteran officer who had been brought in to lead the reform department. As Alex entered, Lydia looked up with a smile. "Agent Washington, always good to see you. How does it feel to be back?" Alex took a moment to consider the question. "It feels, hopeful," she replied honestly. "There's still a long way to go, but seeing this place now compared to a year ago, it's like night and day." Lydia nodded, her expression turning serious. "We owe a lot of that to you, you know. Your work didn't just expose corruption, it gave us a chance to start over, to do things right." As they continued to chat, Alex's phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made her pause: "Former Officer Luke Carter to be released on parole." Lydia noticed Alex's expression change. "Everything okay?" Alex showed her the headline. "I guess I knew this day would come eventually. I just, I wonder if he's really changed, you know?" Lydia considered this for a moment. "People can change, Alex. It's not easy, and not everyone manages it. But sometimes, facing the consequences of our actions can be the wake-up call we need." As Alex left the precinct that day, she found herself reflecting on the journey of the past year. The corruption she had exposed had been a cancer eating away at the heart of law enforcement, but its removal had allowed for healing, for growth. She thought about Luke, about the choices that had led him down a dark path, and about the long road of redemption that lay ahead of him. She thought about the new recruits, full of idealism and hope, and about the responsibility they carried to learn from the mistakes of the past. Most of all, she thought about the community, the people of Eastside who had suffered under corrupt policing, but who had also shown incredible resilience and a willingness to work towards a better future. As she drove through the streets of Eastside, Alex saw signs of that better future everywhere. Community centers bustling with activity, police officers chatting easily with local residents, neighborhoods that felt safer and more connected. The work wasn't done, of course. True change takes time, effort, and constant vigilance. But as Alexandria Washington looked at the city around her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for Eastside, hope for the future of policing, and hope for the enduring power of justice and redemption. The sun was setting as Alex reached her apartment, casting a warm glow over the city. She paused for a moment, taking in the view. The east side of today was not perfect, but it was better. And tomorrow, with continued effort and dedication, it would be better still. In that moment, standing between the long shadow of the past and the bright promise of the future, Alex knew that her work, the real work of justice, of community, of constant striving to be better, was far from over. But she was ready for it, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the lessons of the past and the hope for a better tomorrow. As night fell over East Side, Alexandria Washington smiled. The story of this city and her role in it was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning.